Hello, everyone. God bless you, and welcome back to Ride of the Rohirrim Catholic Podcast. This is technically our fifth episode, but I'm calling it our fourth episode because this is our fourth week. And last week, when we had our two-part episode, was really focused generally, so to speak, on the same topic. So I want to go ahead and call this episode 4. The topics that we're going to cover in today's episode are varied. They're very interesting. They're really fascinating. The things that I would like to talk about today. We're going to cover a lot of material, but please bear with me. I promise it'll all be worth it. There are a couple of key components of today's episode that will kind of act as frameworks for our discussion. The first one is that I would like to go over the theology of the fall of the Noldor, which we spoke about in the last episode. So just to kind of quickly sum up, what happened to the kindred of the elves known as the Noldor in the last episode? Well, led by Feanor, the Noldor rebelled against the Valar, participated in the kinslaying of the Teleri in the city of Alqualonde. They slew their own kin, the Teleri, and then they were exiled from Valinor, from Aman, from the Blessed Realm. They begin a march back to Middle-earth, and then Feanor, in the course of this march, winds up betraying his brother Fingolfin. He and his sons and his people, they take the Teleri ships and they sail across the Great Sea to Middle-earth. Fingolfin realizes that he has been betrayed, and then with this newfound determination in his spirit, he decides to lead his people across the Helcaraxe, the grinding ice that connects Aman, the Blessed Realm, to Endor, to Middle-earth. That's kind of where we left the Noldor. So this collective episode is known as the Darkening of Valinor and the Fall of the Noldor. So one thing I'd like to talk about in this episode is the theology of the Fall of the Noldor. What are some similarities between the way that Tolkien speaks about the creation of the world and specifically the fall of the Noldor that remind us of the biblical story of the fall of Adam and Eve, the fall of man, and the early events in the Torah, the Pentateuch, and the book of Genesis. I would like to go over all of that with you. The next thing I want to go over with you are two key events that were part of the history of the fall of the Noldor, which I did not get to, which I forgot to speak about last episode. Those two events are the prophecy of the North, also known as the Doom of Mandos, the Doom of the Noldor, as well as the fate of Morgoth and Ungoliant during their flight to the north from their destruction of the two trees. So I'd like to talk about both of those events. And then from there, we will move on to studying new content in the next two chapters in the published Silmarillion. I would like to talk about the life of the Sindar elves, the Grey elves, the elves of the Twilight in Beleriand, in Middle-earth. And the other thing I want to talk about is the creation of the sun and moon and the hiding or the fencing of Valinor. These two events take place either before or concomitant with at the same time as the events of our last episode. So when Feanor is leading the Noldor's rebellion against the Valar, and when he curses Melkor, names him Morgoth, those events occur concomitantly with the life of the Sindar, as we're going to talk about in this episode. And then the very last segment of today's episode is going to be devoted to talking about the creation of the sun and the moon and the hiding or the fencing of Valinor against both Melkor and against any attempted return of the Noldor to the Blessed Realm. Remember, now they've been exiled. The first thing I want to talk about, first off, let's get started right away with some theological reflections on the fall of the Noldor. If you read the text of the book of Genesis, specifically the book of Genesis, which is the first book of the Jewish Torah and the first book of the Christian Old Testament, you will read the story of the patriarch Abraham. Abraham is the key figure in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. He is the forefather of what come to be known as the Abrahamic monotheistic faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And he is the most pivotal figure in the Jewish Torah, in the Christian Old Testament. He is the father. He's known as the father of all faith, of people who have faith, the spiritual father of all who have faith in the one God. So Abraham is this really key pivotal figure, and God makes a covenant with Abraham. There are a lot of very important events that surround Genesis. We're not going to get into that. But what I do want to touch on are some things that um, really appear very distinctly in Tolkien's description of some of the events surrounding the creation of the world, the music of the Ainur, as well as the fall of the Noldor. Here's one thing in particular. Abraham is promised by God that he and his wife Sarah will have descendants as numerous as the stars, that they're going to have a lot of children. Now, when this promise is made to Abraham, he and his wife are in their 70s and 80s. They are well beyond their child rearing years. So, how this is possible, neither Abraham nor Sarah can quite figure out. But there comes a point in the book of Genesis when Abraham has become really tired of waiting for God's blessing, of waiting to have a child. So he turns to Sarah and he says to her that he would like to have an heir, he would like to have a child with 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 a concubine. In other words, with a servant of Abraham and Sarah's household. Abraham wants to have a child with that servant as a concubine, and then that child will be brought up as his heir. The servant uh, that he has a child with is Hagar, and the child of Abraham and Hagar is Ishmael. Now, Abraham is reprimanded for like his lack of trust in God and going ahead and having a child outside of his marriage with Sarah. But it is striking that God does bless both Hagar and her son Ishmael. He doesn't abandon them, which is very important. Later on, Abraham and Sarah do have a child of their own. That child becomes the child of promise, and that child is Isaac. So you have Abraham's son by Hagar, who's Ishmael, and Abraham's son by his marriage, who is Isaac. So there's this kind of tension between the side of Isaac and the side of Ishmael. Well, I was very clearly reminded of this in the story of how Finwë, the High King of the Noldor, originally married to Miriel after Miriel faded and passed to the halls of Mandos after she died, when he remarries Indis of the Vanyar. Well, Tolkien tells us very kind of mysteriously that had Finwë um, really put all of his, so to speak, put all of his money and put all of his energies, all of his efforts into raising his mighty son Feanor. If he had simply devoted himself to raising Feanor, rather than going ahead and remarrying somebody else, there were many bad events that would later on occur in the fall of the Noldor that may not have happened if Finwë had simply remained content with raising his son Feanor. But then Tolkien also adds a caveat, a little asterisk to that. He said, but if Finwë had not remarried Indis and then had two children with her, Fingolfin and Finarfin, the history of the Noldor would have been diminished. In other words, the lives of Fingolfin, Finarfin, and their descendants will be significant, will be very great. And had that not taken place, had Finwë not had Fingolfin and Finarfin with Indis, the history of the Noldor would have been both altered and diminished. The history would not be as great. There would have been many mighty and perhaps even good deeds that would not occur because of Fingolfin and Finarfin would not have existed. So I was very much reminded of the kind of the tension between Isaac and Ishmael, and between Abraham's relations with Hagar and Abraham's relationship with his wife Sarah. I was reminded of that when hearing the story of Finwë originally being married to Miriel, then he remarries Indis, who's completely unlike Miriel, and then there's strife between their children, strife between Feanor, the son of Miriel, strife between Feanor and Fingolfin and Finarfin, who are the sons of Indis of the Vanyar. So I was very heavily reminded of that. Focusing in on Feanor, Fingolfin, and Finarfin, one other thing that I was reminded about is this motif of kind of strained or disordered sibling relationships. This motif pops up a lot throughout the history of the fall of the Noldor. You see it both between Feanor, Fingolfin, and Finarfin, half-brothers, and you also see it between the relationship among their respective children. So you see that kind of strained both sibling and kin-cousin relationship between, say, Maithros Maglor, Fingon, Turgon, Arethel, Finrod, Orodreth, Angrod, Aegnor, Galadriel. You see that kind of the kin strife, which really literally comes to bear when Feanor betrays Fingolfin. But where does that show up in the biblical tradition? Well, you really see that in the strife between three sons, Cain, Abel, and Seth. And the other example would be between Shem, Ham, and Japheth, the three sons of Noah. So between the three sons of Adam and Eve, Cain, Abel, and Seth, there's strife. Between the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, you have strife as well. And you have strife between the three sons of Finwë, Feanor, Fingolfin, and Finarfin. I find it hard to believe that that's merely a coincidence. Now, let me make a very important point, pointed out by many Tolkien scholars. Tolkien hated allegory. I mean, he really hated it with a bitter passion. So he hated the idea of writing a story simply for the sake of veiling some other truth beneath the storytelling elements in the story being told. He hated that. What he loved doing was telling a story for a story's own sake. He did not like writing a story with some sort of ulterior motive. So that's been established. Tolkien himself admitted that there are times in which an author wanting to inject his own personal values or beliefs into a story may lead to certain elements of allegory that are kind of unavoidable. Nevertheless, this is not his aim. This is certainly not his goal. He does not like allegory. However, that being said, the Silmarillion, the Hobbit, the Lord of the Rings, they're not allegories. But, without question, I would say that Tolkien's Catholic imagination permeates and colors all of his written work. So what do I mean by that? Well, Tolkien was a devout Catholic from his childhood, from his birth. His mother was a convert to Catholicism. Tolkien, in fact, was raised by a certain Father Francis Morgan, and Father Francis Morgan raised Tolkien and his brother. After they were orphaned, after their mother and their father passed away, Father Francis Morgan brought them up and raised them in the Birmingham Oratory in England. The Birmingham Oratory, about 70 years earlier, had been the home of one of the greatest theologians and soon to be saint in the history of the Catholic Church, St. John Henry Cardinal Newman. Cardinal Newman is going to be canonized as a saint on Sunday, October 13th, in about a week and a half. And Cardinal Newman's kind of the place where he theologized and where he spoke from the pulpit, the place where he preached until his death, was the same Birmingham Oratory where 70 years later a young J.R.R. Tolkien, an orphan with his brother, would be raised by Father Francis Morgan. And if you go to visit the Birmingham Oratory today, you will still see a trunk with big letters printed on it, Tolkien, in which Tolkien and his brother kept all of their personal belongings. Under the care of Father Francis Morgan. So all that being said, Tolkien was a Catholic from his birth. It was inevitable, as any person of faith would admit, of any religious faith, that when you go and you write something or you create a work of art or you do some sort of creative work, that your faith is going to kind of imbue and permeate that work. Either you may do it consciously, but more often than not, it's going to happen unconsciously. So what do I mean by that? Tolkien approaches the world with it from a Catholic worldview, with a Catholic worldview from a Catholic world, from a Catholic perspective. Everything that he sees in the world, he sees through a Catholic lens. So when he writes the Silmarillion and the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings, although he's not doing it intentionally, he's writing about the people, the characters, the themes, the setting, the time period, all of the major events. He's writing about those things as he sees them as a Catholic. So when Tolkien is ruminating and thinking about in his head about how to structure the family of Finwë and of his three sons, he says, gee, what would be kind of a dynamic that would naturally arise from Finwë having three sons, with one being the child of one marriage and the two others being the child of a different marriage? Well, he imagines strife between that. Well, the idea, the reason that likely came to Tolkien's head was because of his Catholic worldview founded in sacred scripture, which goes all the way back to the book of Genesis with the strife between Cain, Abel, and Seth, and Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So in other words, it is Tolkien's is foundation in the scriptures and his Catholic worldview that has kind of given his imagination a distinctively Catholic flavor, which has then animated all of his work unconsciously. Were it conscious, it would be allegory, but we know that Tolkien hated allegory, so we're going to call it unconscious. So now we've seen it between Finwë remarrying Indis after his marriage with Mediel, similar to Abraham and Hagar and Abraham and Sarah. Now we see it with the strife between Feanor, Fingolfin, and Finarfin, the strife between Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and Cain, Abel, and Seth. What are some other biblical themes that I've noticed in the history of the Silmarillion, and specifically the fall of the Noldor? Well, there's one major element: table fellowship on Taniquetil. Now remember, Taniquetil is Manwë's holy mountain. It's the mountain where he has his high seat. It's the tallest peak in all of Arda, from which he looks out on all the world. He can see to the uttermost east, to the lands of the rising sun, which are uninhabited. He can see all over Arda from this high seat upon his high holy mountain, Taniquetil. Manwë acting as Iluvatar's vicar, Iluvatar's representative among the Valar and among all of the children of Iluvatar. So what do I mean by table fellowship on Taniquetil? Well, table fellowship is a very common theme motif in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. So both in the Jewish scriptures and in the Christian scriptures. Table fellowship shows up, for example, when the three strangers come to visit Abraham, and Abraham goes inside and he feeds them. He sets a table before them. He gives them food. It shows up in the prophecies of Isaiah, when Isaiah prophesies that in the future kingdom, in the future kingdom of heaven, the future kingdom of God, all the nations of the earth, not just Israel, but all the nations of the earth will stream towards God's holy mountain, where they will all feast and dine together, and where the lion will lay down with the lamb, and all predators will lay down with the prey that they used to prey upon. But there'll be peace, there'll be harmony, there'll be no more bloodshed, there'll be no more war, no more tears. There will be complete peace and love and faith, hope and love will permeate this table fellowship. So it's very much a biblical image, culminating for Christians. That motif culminates in the Lord's Supper and the institution of the Blessed Sacrament and of the Eucharist. I would just like to point out, as I guess you can kind of call this a little bit of a trailer for a future episode, when we get to the Akallabeth, the history of the downfall of Numenor in the Second Age, we're going to really heavily return to this theme of table fellowship and of the idea of sacrifice offered to God, or in the case of the Silmarillion, to Iluvatar. We're really going to touch on that very heavily when we speak about the Akallabeth in a couple of weeks or so. So just keep that in mind. We'll be talking about that a lot more when we talk about the downfall of Numenor. But just for now, where does the theme of table fellowship show up surrounding Taniquetil, Manwë's holy mountain? Where does it show up in all of the Silmarillion? Well, we know that Melkor and Ungoliant destroyed the two trees at a time of festival, during a time when Manwë has declared a high feast in praise to Iluvatar, a feast celebrating the first fruits of Yavanna's harvest, and then all of the dwellers within Aman, within the Blessed Realm, Maiar, Valar, all of the elves, all creatures that live in Aman, with the exception of Ungoliant, they go and they celebrate on Taniquetil, on Manwë's mountain. Manwë actually commands Feanor to come to the feast. Trying to think of what else. Oh, so and in that very feast is mentioned the fact that part of Yavanna's harvest was this wheat that she grew in her pastures, and Tolkien calls it the tall wheat of the gods. Now, you can kind of translate wheat of the gods into another phrase, bread of the Valar, because wheat is bread, and then the gods is just a reference to the Valar. And who are the Valar? Well, they're not gods. They would say that there's only one god, one creator, Iluvatar, the one. So they're not really gods. So what are they? We can kind of call them, like, in Christian theology, in Christian terms, it would be like archangels. So you can translate from bread of the Valar to bread of angels. Well, bread of angels happens to be a catch-all Christian term for the Eucharist, for the Blessed Sacrament, for the body and blood of Jesus Christ. So there, right there, there's a Eucharistic reference, a reference to table fellowship. Um, where do we really see this theme come to play? We really see it with Feanor and what he does not do when he comes to Taniquetil during this feast. What doesn't he do? Well, Tolkien tells us that he does not come in raiment of festival. What exactly does that mean? He doesn't come in raiment of festival. Well, he doesn't come dressed for the feast, for this great celebration, this liturgical celebration, in fact, in praise to Iluvatar. He doesn't come dressed as one would appropriately come dressed to a feast, to a celebration. And he was commanded to come, so the fact that he doesn't come properly dressed is even more of an insult to Manwë and through Manwë to Iluvatar. Now, what's the significance of that? Well, as soon as I read that, I was instantly reminded of the parable of Jesus, the famous parable of the wedding banquet. The parable of the wedding banquet says that a kingly lord hosts this banquet. He invites everyone, and someone shows up to the feast not wearing the proper clothes for the wedding banquet. What happens? The master of the house, the thrower of the feast, I guess you could say, he throws that person out from the party. He throws them out of the doors, and then the parable says that he was wailing outside with weeping and gnashing of teeth. Essentially, he was cast into hell after he's cast out of this wedding banquet. What was the motivation for him being cast out like this? Because he wasn't wearing the proper clothes. Because he was not wearing the proper clothes. Now, where do we see that in Feanor not coming dressed to the feast in honor of Iluvatar on Taniquetil? Well, what happens, not immediately after, but maybe a couple pages after Feanor does not come properly dressed, what happens? He is cast out along with all his people from Aman, from the Blessed Realm. So just like the guest shows up to the king's wedding banquet not wearing the proper clothing, and he's thrown out where there's weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. So Feanor and all of his people are cast out of Aman, of the Blessed Realm, after he does not show up to the feast in honor of Iluvatar wearing the proper attire. And where are they cast out to? They're cast out to a place where there's weeping, wailing, and gnashing of teeth. To Beleriand, which is under the shadow of Morgoth. And Mandos, as we're going to speak about in a few minutes, foretells that they will meet nothing but slaying, torment, and grief where they're going. And not even the cries of their lamentation will pass back over the walls of the Pelori and reach the ears of the Valar. Forever shut out, forever deprived of any relief, exiled to death, to die. Tolkien's Catholic imagination was really active in these early chapters of the Silmarillion. One last thing, and then we'll move on. I could not help but think, all the way back to the beginning of the book of Genesis, when Adam and Eve eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, tempted by Satan, by the serpent. They're cast out of Eden, and they are exiled to slave over the earth, essentially. Well, what is at the center of Eden from which Adam and Eve were cast out? Two trees. The tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. What is at the center of Aman, the Blessed Realm, from which Feanor and his people were exiled? The two trees, Telperion and Laurenen. Now, one is not necessarily good and one not necessarily evil, so it's not a direct comparison, which then just goes to tell us this is not really allegory. This is simply Tolkien's, his imagination permeated by his Catholic faith at work. So just as Feanor and his people were cast out of the Blessed Realm, and at the heart of the Blessed Realm were two trees, so also Adam and Eve were cast out from Eden, from the Garden of Eden, from paradise, at the center of which stood two trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, I'd like to point out that one of the two trees in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life is mentioned again in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, as a reference to the cross of Christ, cross on which Christ was crucified, redeeming all of humanity, reopening the gates of paradise to mankind, to sinners. Well, isn't there also a distinction about one of the two trees in Valinor in particular? Yes. Telperion, the white tree or the silver tree. A seedling, or I'm sorry, not yet. A lesser image of Telperion, of the silver tree, is made for the Vanyar and the Noldor in the city of Tirion. When they cry out this prayer to Yavanna, Yavanna makes them a lesser image of Telperion, only different in the fact that it does not give light of its own being. It merely reflects light that surrounds it. This copy of Telperion is known as, I'm trying to remember the name, Galathilion. And then a seedling of Galathilion is Celeborn. Celeborn is planted on Tol Eressëa, the Lonely Isle. And then the elves of Eressëa give a seedling of Celeborn to the men of Numenor. That seedling becomes Nimloth the Fair, the white tree of Numenor. And from the white tree of Numenor comes the white tree that we know in the Court of the Fountain, in Minas Tirith, in the Lord of the Rings. You know, that dead white tree that shows up in the Return of the King? Yeah, that is a descendant of Nimloth, a descendant of Celeborn, a descendant of Galathilion, which was a copy of Telperion, the white tree of Valinor. So the white tree of the kings of Numenor is a descendant of the white tree of Valinor. Well, the cross, the tree of life, is the perfected tree of life from the Garden of Eden. And humankind was cut off from the tree of life when Adam and Eve fell. Were cut off from the tree of life, prevented from returning to it. When Christ was crucified, the gates of paradise were reopened and the way to the tree of life was opened again. Once again, Tolkien's Catholic imagination at work. So those were just a couple of reflections I wanted to touch upon. Thank you guys for listening to that. The next thing I want to get into are two key events that took place during the events of the fall of the Noldor that I did not get to last episode. The first one is the prophecy of the North, better known as the Doom of Mandos or the Doom of the Noldor. So let's set the scene. Feanor in the van with his 7 sons, Fingolfin and Finarfin behind, are leading their people along the coast of Aman, northwards. Remember, they're traveling east of the Pelori, but west of the shores of Valinor. So they're traveling in the coastline between the sea and the Pelori Mountains. So they're traveling along this coastline, which is getting wider as they go farther north, but it's also getting more desolate, and it's turning into an icy wasteland. As they draw closer and closer to the Hel Caraxe, the grinding ice, this region becomes known as Araman. Araman is a desolate, icy wasteland, a barren, uninhabited wasteland, over which the entire host of the Noldor is traveling during their great march back to Middle-earth. And as they're in Araman, they see a figure standing upon a rock, tall and dark. A figure whose voice is so powerful that it causes the entire great host of the Noldor, numbering likely hundreds of thousands of people, of elves, stop at a dead standstill because of the voice of this lone figure standing upon this rock. Now, Tolkien tells us that it is either Mandos himself, or at the very least, it's a herald of Manwë. Now, evidence later on will suggest to us that it was a herald of Manwë, and we'll get to what that evidence is later on. But for now, let's just let's hold back and let's say for now that it's either Mandos himself or a herald of Manwe. And these are the words that this figure speaks to the Noldor. To sum up, to paraphrase some of the things that are said. The figure says that the wrath of the Valar lies on Feanor, the Noldor, and all who follow them from the west onto the uttermost east. The figure says that the Noldor will die by slaying, by torment, and by grief. Although they will not die of natural causes, they will either be killed or they will die by torment or by grief. The figure says that the Valar, while not hindering the Noldor from leaving, just as they came to Valinor freely, so they may leave freely, that this decision will be their doom. There will be no coming back from this decision to leave. Those who manage to escape being killed in Middle-earth will spend so long in toil in Beleriand, in Middle-earth, that they will eventually fade before the eyes of the aftercomers, before the eyes of men, because men are the aftercomers. They will fade, turn to nothingness. And those who are slain, their spirits will be summoned to Mandos, and no one will intercede for them. So in Christian theology, we have the idea of purgatory, and if a soul is detained in purgatory, the prayers of their loved ones on earth may help to lessen their time spent in purgatory. Well, Mando says, not for the Noldor. There are no prayers that are going to reach the Noldor, and not even the prayers of those they have slain, a reference to the Teleri at Alqualonde. Not even the prayers of those they have slain will be able to bring relief to the Noldor and Mandos. They will spend their detainment in Mandos until the end of the world, or until the Dagor Dagorath. The Noldor are going to suffer treason of kin unto kin, and the fear of treason. Valinor is forever shut and fenced against the Noldor. They may never return thither, and not even the cries of the lamentation of the Noldor in Middle-earth. So the figure is predicting that they will cry out in anguish and despair in Middle-earth. Not even the cries of their lamentation will reach the ears of the Valar. They're not even going to get over the walls of the Pelori. No one's going to hear their cries. The Noldor are forever cast out, cut off from the life of the Blessed Realm because of their decision. This is known as the doom of Mandos, which is going to follow after Feanor and Fingolfin and their descendants for ages and ages and ages. What is Feanor's response to the figure and to the doom of Mandos? Feanor says, "We have sworn, and not lightly, but this oath we will keep. We are threatened with many evils, and treason not the least. But what is not foretold is that we will suffer from cravens," basically from cowardice, "or the fear of cravens. So we will go on. And this I will say, that the deeds that we shall do will live on in song forever after." And when Feanor pronounces those words, his doom is decreed. His people's doom is decreed. One alone among the great host returns back in grief and sorrow and regret, returns back to Tirion and to Valinor. Unsurprisingly, it's Finarfin, the wisest and youngest of the three children of Finwë. He and a number of his people, but not his children. His children continue alongside the sons of Fingolfin. Finarfin and his people return to Tirion. They receive the pardon of the Valar, and then Finarfin becomes the High King of the Noldor in Valinor, ruling the remnants of the Noldor in Tirion, in the place of his two brothers and his father. And thus the doom of the Noldor is decreed. The next event that I wanted to touch on, also occurring during the events of the fall of the Noldor, was the flight of Melkor and Ungoliant to the north after the destruction of the trees. So after the destruction of Telperion and Laurelin, outside the western gates of Valmar, Melkor and Ungoliant flee to the north, and they cross over the Helcaraxe, and they come to the land north of the Firth of Drengest in Beleriand. So they've reached Middle-earth. And Ungoliant, with her many eyes, sees Melkor's hope increasing ever as they go step by step closer to the ruins of Melkor's fortress of Angband. So remember, Angband is in the far north of Beleriand. Once they cross the Helcaraxe, they're super close to it. Super close. And the closer they get, the more hopeful Melkor is becoming. He's saying, okay, maybe I can get out of this without having to give anything to this creature, to Ungoliant. Right? Remember, he's evil. Even in the conspiring between two evil beings, there's no love, there's no sympathy. Melkor wants out of this without having to do anything for or give anything to Ungoliant. The closer he's getting to Angband, the more he's saying, I want to get out of the reach of this gigantic, psychopathic, monstrous spider. I'm close to my old fortress. Hopefully, I won't have to give her anything. Hopefully, I can lose her, basically. But Ungoliant sees this. Remember, she's a Maiar spirit. She's smart. She has intellectual, spiritual powers, capabilities. And she says, Blackheart, Blackheart, I have done thy bidding. I've done what you wanted me to do. So, hand over the money. Hand over the moolah. Where's my payment? And then Melkor says, what more wouldst thou have? You already sucked up all the dews of the two trees and from the wells of Varda. What more do you want? Do you want all the world for thy belly? No, I didn't promise to give you that. I am its lord. Melkor actually tells her that. He says, I am the lord of Arda. And then Ungoliant says, not so much. Not really. You're not really the lord of Arda. But you have a great treasure from Formenos. Remember that Melkor slew Finwë before his doors, stole the Silmarils, and stole a whole bunch of the gems, the prized possessions of the Noldor from Formenos. So he has all of those. And Ungoliant says, yeah, I'm going to have all that. Give me all of the treasures that you found from Formenos. So Melkor grudgingly feeds her each and every gem. Except for 3. Because he keeps the Silmarils close to his chest, locked in their silver casket. And Ungoliant sees this. And Ungoliant also sees that the Silmarils are burning his hand. And that his hand is clenched in pain. Remember, that was a curse that Varda placed upon the Silmarils when she hallowed them after Feanor created them. It says that if any evil hand were to touch them, if they were able to touch them, they would be burned black by the touch. So Melkor's hands are burning. His hands are clenched in pain as he's holding them, but he refuses to give them up. He says, these things I name unto myself forever. You will not get these. These are mine. Remember how long Melkor lusted for the Silmarils. He's not going to give them up that easily. Those happen to be the very same words that Thorin will one day speak when speaking about the Arkenstone. During the quest for the Lonely Mountain, after Smaug is defeated, in his search for the Arkenstone, he names the Arkenstone unto himself forever. And he promises revenge against anybody who withholds it from him. That's during the events of The Hobbit. The exact same words are placed on the lips of Morgoth. He says, I name these, referring to the Silmarils, unto myself forever. Forever. So what does Ungoliant do? She begins to trap and ensnare Melkor within a network of her webs. She tries to strangle him, trying to wrest the Silmarils from his grasp. And as she's trying to strangle him, Melkor cries this horrific, demonic cry that shakes the foundations of the world. It shakes the mountains to their roots. And it is the loudest and most lamentable cry ever heard in the north of the world. And that cry reached even down deep to the roots of the mountains, reached down deep to vaults to which the Valar, in the haste of their assault on Utumno earlier on in the Battle of the Powers, had not descended. So it reached down to the uttermost pits of Melkor's fortresses. And what beings lied within those pits? Balrogs. Remember, the Balrogs are those Valaraukar, Maiar spirits, spirits of flame, who Melkor enslaved to his service during the music of the Ainur. A Balrog will eventually kill Gandalf the Grey, and he'll rise again as Gandalf the White in The Lord of the Rings. These Balrogs hear their master's cry, and Tolkien tells us very hauntingly and poetically, passing over Hithlum. Hithlum is the land that lies just to the east of the Firth of Drengest. Passing over Hithlum, they came to Lamoth as a tempest of fire, as a storm of fire. What is Lamoth? Well, Lamoth is the name of the land where Ungoliant tries to kill Melkor. Lamoth is an Elvish word that refers to like a cry or a wail, named because of Melkor's cry when Ungoliant's trying to strangle him. And then the Balrogs come and they smote asunder, they break apart Ungoliant's webs with their whips of fire, with their whips of flame. Melkor escapes. He escapes back to Angband with the Silmarils. He delves Angband anew, he refurbishes it essentially, and he rears over the gates of Angband 3 volcanic peaks, the reeking peaks of Thangorodrim. And within his halls in Angband, he forges for himself an iron crown in which he sets the Silmarils upon his head, never to take it off. And although that crown becomes a deadly weariness upon his head, he never removes it, and he never removes the Silmarils from their place in his crown on his head. What happened to Ungoliant? Well, after she was attacked by the Balrogs, she flees, firstly, to the kingdom of Thingol in the forest of Neldoreth. The kingdom of Thingol at this point is known as Eglador, but it eventually will become known as Doriath, which we're going to talk about in a little bit when we talk about the Sindar. But she first flees to the kingdom of Thingol, but she's kept back by the power of Melian, who's the queen of Eglador, the wife of Thingol. And from the kingdom of Thingol, she then retreats to the northern precipices of Dorthonion, the precipices that turn towards the south, and those precipices become known as the Ered Gorgoroth, the mountains of terror, and at their feet, Nan Dungortheb, the valley of dreadful death. And there Ungoliant bred her horror. She had spider children with the other spiders that were already living there before she came there. Those other spiders presumably were other evil Maiar spirits that fell with Melkor. She had children there. One of those children is Shelob, who eventually will come to guard the pass of Cirith Ungol during the events of The Lord of the Rings, which is the same pass that Gollum leads Frodo and Sam through in their journey to Mordor. She guards that pass. Shelob is the child of Ungoliant. And what happens to Ungoliant? Well, Tolkien tells us that the Elvish lore does not know for sure, but it is kind of like a rumor, and it's kind of like circulating public opinion, that eventually Ungoliant became so famished, so lustful, so hungry, that she ate herself at last. Which I think is kind of horrible, but it's poetic justice. It definitely fits her. What happens to Ungoliant, we don't know, but we do know what happens to her children. They spread all over the south of the world, Shelob in particular. Shelob's going to guard the pass of the spider, or the pass of Cirith Ungol, the pass connecting the stairs on the side of the valley of Minas Morgul to the tower of Cirith Ungol, which guards the secret entryway into Mordor. We will get to that when we cover The Lord of the Rings. Morgoth in Angband, remember, he's just rebuilt Angband. He begins breeding more and more orcs. Now remember, there were some surviving orcs from the days of Utumno. He's breeding more and more, and they're growing and multiplying in the bowels of the earth, because Angband is delved deep inside the bowels of the earth. One other thing, Utumno at this point is completely deserted. It obviously remains a place of evil, But at this point, Morgoth is not operating from Utumno any longer. Angband is his principal place of operation. So what was at first his secondary fortress has now become his primary fortress. And there he's forged for himself the Iron Crown in which he sets the Silmarils. And Tolkien tells us something very interesting. He says that so much power had gone out of Morgoth when he empowered Ungoliant to help him in destroying the trees, and when he began to breed more and more orcs, and when he rebuilt Angband, so much power went out of him that he became more and more bound to the earth. So in other words, he became less and less a Valar spirit and more of a being bound to the earth because of the power that's gone out of him. Power that's especially gone into the orcs, inspiring them with a desire for wanton destruction, violence, and bloodshed. So much of his evil has gone into his works, whether it be Ungoliant or rebuilding Angband or breeding more and more orcs, that he's become more bound to the earth and actually less powerful. He does retain the majesty that he once wore as a Valar, as a member of the Valar, but that majesty has been twisted and become terrible, so that he's become this great and terrible Dark Lord, with a face so terrible to look upon that almost everyone who looks upon his face cowers in fear and falls before his face. Now there will be some who are able to withstand his glance. Among them would be Varda, Melian, and Fingolfin. But once more, we'll get to that as time goes on. At this point, Morgoth is sitting on his throne with the Silmarils and his iron crown on his head, and he is telling all of his armies what to do from his northern throne in Angband. He's become ever more bound to the earth. So much evil power has gone out of him that he's become less powerful, in fact. Now we come up to date. We've covered all of the material from last episode. We went through all the recollections that I wanted to go through. I touched on the two events that were concomitant with the events of last week's episode. And now we finally come to new material. We come to the life of the Sindar. The life of the Sindar. I'm going to pause the video right here. Next week we will cover both the life of the Sindar and the creation of the sun and moon and the hiding of Valinor. For now, I just want to pause it here, make this week's video a little bit shorter because I know the last couple of videos have been very long. So we're going to pause it here. Thank you all so much for watching. God bless. Please join us again next week. We're going to talk about the life of the Sindar, of the Sindar elves. We're going to talk about Thingol and Melian. We're going to talk about the creation of the sun and the moon. Thank you all for watching. God bless you. May the grace of God ever go with you. And see you again next week. Thank you guys for joining us.